When the sun sets over Ouagadougou, thousands of women walk into the night, not because they want to, but because society has forgotten them. On Charles de Gaulle Avenue, neon lights cast their glow on young, weary faces. For many years, that silence was seen as a normal part of life in Burkina Faso, a place where survival replaced dreams. But in the year 2025, one man stood up and said, "No woman in this country will have to live like this again." It was not a campaign promise, but a declaration, a call to restore dignity and lost faith. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier turned reformer. From the battlefield, he stepped into the political arena with one clear mission: to rebuild the lives of women, and through them, to restore the soul of the nation. But one question remains: how can a leader turn such a declaration into reality? If you too want to find the answer, subscribe and stay with me until the end of this story. The truth reveals that Burkina Faso was trapped in a silent war, not fought with weapons, but with poverty, inequality, and despair. Beneath the red dust of the Sahel, where the horizon stretches endlessly, the struggle for survival often began in silence and ended in shame. When Ibrahim Traoré took power, the numbers painted a haunting picture. According to UNAIDS, more than 30,000 women were working in prostitution, most not by choice but because of poverty. In the Sahel region, where over 40% of the population lived below the poverty line, drought and conflict had taken away the livelihoods of thousands of families. For many single mothers, selling their bodies became the last line between hunger and survival. Education offered little refuge. In the year 2023, the Ministry of Education reported that 63% of rural women had never completed elementary school. Without knowledge of the law or reproductive health, they easily became victims of exploitation and abuse. The country's instability deepened the wound. From the year 2019 to 2024, more than 2 million people were forced to leave their homes because of terrorism and armed conflict. In the refugee camps of Kaya and Djibo, many women were forced to trade their dignity for a meal. Then came the traffickers, criminal networks stretching from Nigeria to Côte d'Ivoire, promising jobs abroad, but instead sending women into foreign brothels. The Interpol report of 2023 called it a silent export of despair. Worse still, corruption spread where the law was weak. An investigation by Junafrique revealed that some local police officers took bribes from brothel owners in Bobo Dioulasso and Banfora, allowing this underground economy to grow into a multi-million-dollar industry. By the year 2024, prostitution was no longer just a personal tragedy. It had become a national illness, eroding trust, families, and the moral fabric of the nation. But as the country faced its own pain, a new voice rose not in anger, but in determination. That voice belonged to Ibrahim Traoré, carrying a single message: Burkina Faso will not sell its soul to survive. In October of 2025, the winds of change began to sweep through Ouagadougou. Inside the National Women's Conference Hall, the air was heavy with anticipation. Hundreds of women, farmers, teachers, and former sex workers gathered under one roof, waiting to see whether the new leader's promises would fade like all those before. Then Ibrahim Traoré stepped to the podium. He did not speak like a politician, but like a soldier who had seen too much of what poverty could do to human dignity. Prostitution, he said, his voice echoing through the marble hall, is not just the sale of a body, it is the sale of a nation's soul. That sentence cut through decades of denial. For the first time, Burkina Faso was forced to confront a forgotten truth that behind every woman standing on the street was a broken promise from the state itself. From that moment, Traoré's vision began to take shape, a national rebirth, built not on charity, but on dignity through work. His government launched a program under that very name, investing 5 billion CFA francs, about $8 million US, from the national budget and local development funds. The plan was bold: to help 10,000 women leave prostitution, receive vocational training, access healthcare, and rebuild their lives. Each woman would no longer be a number, but a citizen in her own right. Many were skeptical. Western analysts called it idealistic. Some at home questioned how a struggling economy could afford moral restoration when even basic infrastructure remained weak. But Traoré responded in the only way he knew, through action. Within months, construction teams began clearing ground for the first factories. Social workers were sent into red light districts to offer new options. And for the first time in years, many women dared to imagine the impossible, a future of their own. What began as a speech had now become a movement, a test of whether moral courage could triumph over economic despair. But the world would soon learn this was only the beginning. Factories began to rise where silence once ruled. By September of 2025, the dry plains around Peni began to echo with the sound of machines. A cashew processing factory, the first project under Ibrahim Traoré's program, had been built on land that was once abandoned. Inside the factory gates, thousands of women worked in neat uniforms, their laughter blending with the rhythm of production lines. More than 5,000 jobs were created, 4,500 of which belonged to women who had once lived in fear. For them, this was not just work, it was redemption. Soon after, 2 textile factories opened in Kudugu and Uwahiguya, creating jobs for over 2,000 women. One worker said, "Every stitch I sew is a prayer that my daughter will never have to live as I once did." At the end of that September, President Ibrahim Traoré visited the factory. He shook hands with the workers and spoke not as a distant head of state, but as a companion. His words, broadcast live on national radio, became a symbol of renewal. A free nation is one where women live by their hands, not by their fear. The applause that followed marked the beginning of a new era. Burkina Faso was no longer just producing cashews, it was producing hope. Profits from the factories flowed into families, schools, and health centers, turning a government project into a community revival. Yet Traoré reminded his people, the true wealth of a nation is not in what it exports, but in the value its people believe they possess. The revolution of dignity did not stop at industry. It reached schools, villages, churches, and mosques. Schools once abandoned were reopened. The Girls to School Again program, newly launched, brought more than 12,000 girls back to classrooms. In villages like Kaya and Banfora, young girls in blue uniforms carried books instead of water buckets. Mothers who once feared for their daughters' futures now watched them walk to school with pride and hope. In October of 2025, the government enacted Decree No. 2025-10, increasing penalties for pimping and human trafficking, and launched the SOS Dignity Hotline, allowing victims to report abuse anonymously. More than 5 women's recovery centers opened in Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, Kaya, Banfora, and Fada Ngurma. There, women learned tailoring, baking, computer skills, and small business management. Many wept when they first created something with their own hands, not from fear, but from pride. Over 300 mosques and 200 churches joined the national campaign, Respect Women, Respect the Nation, calling for equality and human dignity. Gradually, social stigma faded, and women once rejected by society were welcomed again. Across Burkina Faso, a simple phrase began to spread: work is prayer. This was no longer a story of survival, it was the rebirth of a nation, where women who once feared the light now stand proudly beneath the sunday. Among the thousands of women transforming Burkina Faso, one name became the symbol of that change: Awa Traoré. At the age of 26, Awa had spent 3 years on the poor streets of Gangin, Ouagadougou. Each night, she worked only to earn enough to feed her child. "I never chose this life," she said. "I just wanted my daughter to eat." When she first heard about President Ibrahim Traoré's program, Dignity Through Work, she didn't believe it. But when social workers came to her home and invited her to join a training program at the Peni factory, she agreed to try. Now Awa works in the factory, shelling cashews and sending her daughter to school with the wages she earns herself. "I'm no longer afraid of daylight," she said. "Now I go to work when the sun rises." Awa's story, broadcast on national television, became the image of a new Burkina Faso, a nation where restoring dignity is not just a promise, but a policy. Across the country, other women followed. A refugee from Djibo who opened a bakery in Bobo, Dioulasso, a widow in Fada Ngurma who teaches sewing to young girls. They appeared in newspapers and on billboards as living proof of renewal. Each story became a part of the picture. Ibrahim Traoré was building a picture of work and dignity. Today, the results of the movement are clear. According to Business and Human Rights, crime in mining areas has dropped by 15%, and new HIV infections among women have fallen sharply. In Ouagadougou, neighborhoods once known for vice are now home to shops, tailoring workshops, and cafes. Women sell fabrics, woven baskets, and cashew oil, all proudly labeled "Made in Burkina Faso." Religious leaders have also joined the effort. During prayers and services, they call for respect for women and national dignity. The slogan "Respect Women, Respect the Nation" appears on buses, markets, and schools, supported by local businesses. Communities have begun to welcome and respect women once rejected. At weddings and community events, they are now invited and honored. Mothers who once stayed silent now tell their daughters, "You are worth more than what the world says." The economic impact has spread widely. Women's cooperatives have emerged across provinces, expanding cashew and handicraft exports, and forming fair trade partnerships with Europe. Women now control their own income and their own lives. At the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré remains humble. "It was not I who liberated them, it was they who liberated the nation." His leadership rests on faith in people, not power. As international journalists arrive, the world begins to ask, how did a poor nation turn its pain into strength? And for the first time, Ouagadougou is being mentioned not for tragedy, but for transformation. As time went on, what had begun as a small social reform program in Burkina Faso became a phenomenon that international observers could no longer ignore. News reports from across Africa began crossing borders, telling the story of a young captain who dared to fight exploitation, not with weapons, but with work. The United Nations praised the initiative as a model of moral economics, highlighting how the Dignity Through Work program combined employment, justice, and social reintegration within a single system. The African Union called it a social renaissance, urging neighboring nations such as Niger, Mali, and Ghana to adopt similar models. Even the World Health Organization, WAS, recorded the program's clear impact on the physical and mental health of women. Western media, initially skeptical, gradually changed their tone. A BBC report described Ibrahim Traoré as a reformer who leads through moral conviction rather than political theater. CNN aired a feature titled "From Darkness to Dawn: The Burkina Faso Experiment." The Washington Post published an editorial asking, "Is Africa, through Ibrahim Traoré, showing the world that dignity can become policy?" In Europe, journalists compared Traoré's doctrine to the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, a reconstruction not of buildings, but of spirit. Academic institutions began studying the model, calling it the Dignity Doctrine. Meanwhile, leaders across the continent quietly took notes. In Senegal, the government began consultations to implement parts of the program. The Ghanaian Ministry of Women requested bilateral talks to learn from Burkina Faso's experience. What made this model truly remarkable was not its scale, but its origin. Burkina Faso was not a superpower. It had no oil, no military empire, no multinational sponsors. It was simply a small landlocked country that chose to believe in itself again. And at the center of it all stood a leader with a message that transcended politics. "We are not asking the world for pity," Traoré declared in a televised address. "We are asking for respect." Those words carried far beyond Africa's borders. They were not spoken in defiance, but in dignity. And as applause echoed across the continent, another question began to rise across the Atlantic. What can America learn from this? In the United States, commentators struggled to fit Ibrahim Traoré into any political mold. He was neither a populist nor a technocrat. For many Americans following African affairs, he represented something rare in modern politics: moral clarity paired with tangible results. A special report by NPR called him the young captain of African dignity, while The Atlantic observed that his policies blurred the line between social reform and spiritual leadership. Older Americans, who had witnessed the civil rights era, felt a sense of nostalgia, a time when leadership was measured by principle, not power. In universities, discussions about the Burkina Faso experiment began appearing in courses on ethics, post-colonial economics, and leadership studies. Scholars compared Traoré's dignity doctrine to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, noting that both were born from economic despair yet anchored in human worth. Some conservative voices in Washington saw him as a nationalist reformer, while progressives admired his fight against systemic inequality. For once, both America's left and right agreed on something. Dignity, the core of democracy, had found a new voice in Africa. At the United Nations General Assembly, when Traoré spoke, the room fell silent. "We did not ask for aid," he said slowly. "We asked for respect." It was a reminder that leadership does not always wear a suit or speak English. Sometimes it wears a beret and carries conviction instead of fear. Major newspapers around the world ran editorials asking a question that transcended borders. Can America, the nation that once taught the world about freedom, learn again from a country rebuilding it from nothing? For many, the story of Burkina Faso became a mirror of humanity, not of Africa's weakness, but of the shared potential for rebirth. And then came the moment that moved the world. Thousands of women stood shoulder to shoulder, singing beneath the red, green and gold flag as the sun rose over Penny. The world watched, and for the first time in many years, it did not look down on Africa. It looked up. In August of 2026, a report shook the corridors of international institutions. The newly released Women of Dignity Index revealed that 68% of women who joined Burkina Faso's Dignity Through Work program had secured stable employment. National GDP in key rural regions rose by 12%. Even the World Bank, once cautious, acknowledged the initiative as a rare example of social policy transforming productivity. But the real twist wasn't in the numbers, it was in the symbolism. Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed by global media as a temporary revolutionary, was invited to speak at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. Dressed in his signature fatigues and red beret, he didn't come with grand promises or political boasts. Instead, he spoke of labor, pride, and the moral wealth of a nation rediscovering its soul. "We are not asking for aid," he said, his voice firm and measured. "We are asking for respect." In that moment, something rare happened. Applause broke out before he even finished. Delegates from across the world stood to their feet. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about truth. Western analysts began calling his philosophy the dignity doctrine. Commentators drew comparisons to leaders like Thomas Sankara and Nelson Mandela, figures who redefined freedom not as privilege, but as purpose. For the first time, the name Burkina Faso became synonymous not with poverty, but with pride. And for the women who once hid from daylight, the world's spotlight finally became their own. The morning sun rose over Penny, spilling gold across the cashew factory that once was only red soil and hope. Thousands of women stood in rows, singing, waving flags, and celebrating not religion but rebirth. From afar, President Ibrahim Traoré watched in silence, his beret held to his chest. He didn't need to speak. His people spoke for him. The same hands once fighting to survive were now building Burkina Faso's future. Journalists called it Africa's quiet revolution. It wasn't born in palaces or funded by outsiders. It grew from villages, mothers, and the rhythm of work and faith. That single image, women standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the red, green, and gold flag, spread worldwide. For once, headlines didn't say, "Crisis in Africa," but "The nation that chose dignity." That photograph defined a decade, proof that revolutions don't always roar. Sometimes they sing. And for every woman who once feared the night, the sunrise had finally come. When the sun rises over Ouagadougou today, its light no longer hides. The city once drowned in silence now beats with the rhythm of women walking to work, carrying not despair, but purpose and faith. Across Burkina Faso, markets open, factories come alive, and children laugh on their way to school. Prostitution still exists, as it does everywhere, but it no longer defines this nation, nor the women themselves. In just a few years, Ibrahim Traoré turned a national wound into a lesson for the world. That progress is not measured by skyscrapers or GDP charts, but by how a people restore their own dignity. He proved that poverty can be defeated not only with money, but with meaning, that freedom does not have to be granted, but can be reclaimed through labor and human faith. In one of his final speeches of 2025, Traoré declared, "We did not ask permission to be free. We stood up and took it." Today, those words are carved at the entrance of the Penny factory, where, every morning, women read them as a reminder that they themselves have written a new chapter of African history. Now, The world looks toward Africa not with pity, but with admiration. Because when women rise, nations rise. When dignity returns, humanity awakens. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe to witness the rise of an Africa that no longer bows its head. God bless Africa,